So my name is Jonathan Purkis. I'm 60 years old. I was born in Hull in East Yorkshire in the north of England. And I currently live in the Pennines west of Huddersfield, in the centre of Luddite territory, kind of Marsden, and that's which is it's kind of quite a radical place and radical valley. So I can say a little bit more about that as we go on. But that's where I've currently been for the last 5 or 6 years. Yeah, grew up in Hull. My parents were of the generation where the first working class generation going to university. So they're sort of scholarship generation, people from working class backgrounds. They became teachers, and they were pretty progressive, without being like outlandishly kind of like spectacularly kind of alternative. They were vegetarians, they were Quakers, into health foods in the 1970s. Didn't have a television for a lot of my childhood. Being brought up, being the only vegetarian in class, suddenly, it was a talking point. So I think I've kind of got used to that sort of being a bit different, throughout my life. I think that was kind of quite a good start, but obviously, you run into difficulties, later in life, when you stick your head up with the parapet. But so that was so they were teach progressives, and in terms of introducing me to ideas. Yeah, I suppose it was just kind of like, slow, gentle socialization about, around justice issues, animal welfare issues. My mum got involved in kind of groups like that. In fact, one of my first groups was an animal rights group. CND was obviously kind of very much part of the debate in the early 80s. And one of my first demos, I think, was, some of the 1983 marches, which were, when the world really did feel as scary as it does now, actually. It was one of those kind of times which people who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis will probably tell you the same thing, but it definitely did feel quite scary in 1983. So they were teachers. They didn't. What was nice, actually, they didn't pressure me to kind of have a particular kind of career path. And it took me a while to work out. I wanted to go and do a sociology degree and I went to Lancaster University. There's a lot starts from there, really, in terms of my anarchist education, I think. So up until maybe going to university, my contact with anarchism was quite kind of minimal. It was the punk era, but I wasn't really listening to punk. I was listening to kind of West Coast American psychedelia and jazz and and prog rock. So it wasn't really. I wasn't really into kind of Crass and the Poison Girls and the Clash and all those bands until a bit later on. And I knew a few people in the direct action movements who were kind of involved in kind of more kind of class struggle anarchism. So I did kind of read people like Malatesta at about sort of 17, 18, but I didn't really get, I suppose, a kind of like a proper anarchist education until I went to Lancaster University. And I was very fortunate to do it. I think it was the first ever undergraduate degree in module in anarchism on a degree program in the UK. So I did a sociology degree with some politics modules, and one of which was on modern anarchism. It was taught by Tom Cahill, who became a kind of a good friend and mentor, really. He set up the Bulletin of Anarchist Research, which then became Anarchist Studies. So I did a dissertation on anarcho-feminism with him. So I was getting a lot of feminism, reading all of those kind of classic pamphlets, Carol Ehrlich, Peggy Cornegger. In fact, actually, it was really nice listening to Elaine Leader's interview, because she said that she'd done something with those two, which was unpublished. I was like, whoa, that sounds like something worth exploring. So that's kind of in terms of at Lancaster, and I became involved with the anarchist group there. Sort of then got saddled with doing a lot of the organising. I was a part of a radical green group there as well. And yeah, I mean, outrageous publications and sort of pamphlets and all the rest of it. And that sort of set me up really for a lot of my the sort of subsequent things to do with the books and so forth. If you want to, we can continue talking about that if you like. What was nice with what Tom did really was sort of open the door to what was the London-based anarchist research group. It was a lot of people who were convened by David Goodway, who's a historian from Leeds, and a whole group of people who became, kind of friends and kind of colleagues. Met once a couple of months in London, and so he encouraged me to go to those meetings. I think it was a few years before I gave a paper on transport, which then became the hitchhiking thing, which of course there's another aspect of my writing. And what was great about that is that Tom encouraged me to write for the Bulletin of Anarchist Research, but he also started to kind of encourage me to kind of think about putting together a book. And then David Goodway kind of said, well, actually, there's these people I know at Cassell, they might be interested in a book on contemporary anarchism. So from various people I met in the anarchist research group, they wrote various chapters for what became 21st century anarchism. That came out in 1997. It was interesting because it was a bit of it obviously filled a bit of a gap because it was before the kind of flood of things in the early 2000s. The first kind of because there've been various kind of ways of anarchist publishing, hasn't they? But so our aim there was to try and kind of like decenter some of the kind of economically deterministic kind of anarcho-communist sort of tradition in Britain, to take more diverse perspectives on ecology and technology, sexuality, countercultural music, just to kind of like to sort of decenter the narrative a little bit and kind of open the debates. And mixed reviews, I think it would be fair to say, but it also led to some really good friendships and future working relations with people like John Moore, who was the anarcho-primitivist, who sadly died in 2002. And I mean, I've got lots to say about him if we get time to cover that. But he contributed both of those books, and I've also done introductions to posthumously published books of his as well. So it was a really fruitful time actually. And then I got involved with the journal Anarchist Studies as a book reviews editor, and that I did that for 5-6 years and associate editors. So and it's something I've always been. I'm sort of still in touch with those folks who are now obviously centred around the University of Loughborough, and obviously it's kind of Ruth Kinner's wonderful anarchist think tank, if we can call it that. All these wonderful people there. So that was very much the kind of progression of a kind of the kind of anarchist academic side to my right, and then I got a job as a full-time sociology lecturer, and then taught media and cultural studies. So I was at Manchester Metropolitan University and Liverpool John Moores University, and I actually got a full-time job with anarchism on my CV, which I think is probably quite historically kind of telling. I think that would be harder to do now. So I've had this kind of funny relationship with academia, So I've kind of it's like you're an activist, you're an academic, you don't quite fit in any categories, and that was always a bit of a problem, being kind of put into university research cultures boxes, I guess. I'd seen enough of how the left were around like peace politics, so the revolutionary, Socialist Workers' Party, Revolutionary Communist Party, all these kind of groups. Maybe it's just being kind of middle class and not quite I've been comfortable with the narrative. But I just found the approach too bombastic and simplistic, and it didn't seem to have much space for ecology that I could see. And I'm just trying to remember whether it was Tom Cahill who actually pointed me in the direction of Post-Scarcity Anarchism by Murray Bookchin, which I think, kind of dollar for dollar, but pound for pound, is probably the most important book I've ever read in terms of like its influence on me. So there's something about the critique of Marxism, something about the privileging of ecology as a narrative and a libertarian kind of take on things. So I just started to, it just opened doors really, and it just seemed to fit with the green politics of the time that I was involved with. So it just sort of spoke to me really as the whole idea about domination and hierarchy, as opposed to kind of class analysis and that kind of sort of reform versus revolutionary kind of duality, which I think is actually a kind of paralyzing critique in terms of revolutionary politics, and something I'd kind of think I've never really embraced that. So I think I didn't sort of, there was no point where I sort of said I don't want this type of revolutionary politics, I want that. It was a kind of an emergence of ideas, and I just like the idea of working in non-hierarchical organisations. Challenging though it was, so that was often quite a hard lesson where you had to make, consensus decision making in the middle of a kind of an occupation or something. It's like, my God, how do we deal with this? So that was quite an experience of getting a lot of these ideas, in a short period of time in while I was at college. I think I usually start with decentralization and self-organization, and mutual aid. It's such a useful handle now in the kind of post-COVID world, because people do recognise that that's what we did. In the same way that that there's this kind of myth in British history of kind of we all pulled together in the war kind of so which war was that? But in terms of kind of COVID, I think it is a useful reference point, and I do call myself an anarchist. I will describe things I'm doing as anarchy in action, with no sense of irony, depending on who the context, depending on who I'm talking to. I think calling yourself a social ecologist is probably even more esoteric. So I've never really kind of done that either. So I just try and talk about ecological and local type of politics and self-organizing and mutual aid. Those buzzwords, which I think it feels like you're stepping into somebody else's kind of world and trying to understand it, rather than going, hey, I've got this badge which you don't understand, or I'm superior to you or something. And I think that's something I'm really interested in how we. A friend of mine said recently, it's like, when we're talking to people from the extreme right, you've got the choice to think that you can be right all the time, or maybe you should just try and make a couple of connections. It's like we have to talk, we have to kind of cross some of these divides at some level. And, our experience as anarchists should be as communicators. So we've got to put those ideals into uncomfortable practice. There's the anarchist historian John Quayle, who was actually a neighbour of mine, who wrote a famous book called the Slow Burning Fuse, Lost History of English Anarchism. He once said to me, the great thing about anarchism is it teaches you how to deal with people in business. What he meant really there is it just kind of, you learn to, in anarchism, you just get thrown in the deep end with how to, meetings, sensitivity, turn taking, listening skills, and those, I think, by focusing on those type of things, we can. That's one of the ways forward, and I know you'll want to ask me about that as well. When we have a critique of power, that it is situated within a within nature, that there is no separation, and separation and dualities are the kind of root of so many of our problems. And that so when we're thinking about our social relationships, we've also got to be thinking of how they are connected with the natural support systems, which we're obviously massively eroding, and that. I mean, it's interesting. I often just talk about. I feel like a deep ecologist, but I try and think like a social ecologist. It's like, you've got to have that kind of sensitivity of being, one amongst many species, but you've also have a sense of pragmatics and what is kind of tangible. So getting people to think about where their food comes from, how they travel to the next village. So it's not rural part of Yorkshire where I live. It's kind of all those things about transport deserts, in public transport deserts, where your food comes from, what public services they are. People can relate to those things and they can see, what's affecting the environment. Where I'm talking to you from, we have quite a lot of wildfires on the moors. And there actually are a serious sort of threat to infrastructure. So there's a lot of debates which can quickly emerge around kind of resources, bioregions, access to water, because we've got a lot of half full reservoirs here at the moment as well. So there's like a line of sight about the things which affect you naturally and socially, which you don't get in a city. And I think so. Where I live, I think it's kind of quite useful in that respect for those debates about social ecology. Because you can situate people in terms of, what affects them in their communities. And I think that is actually the heart of the kind of anarchist politics, really. It's like, those immediate sort of tribal associations. My PhD was on the group Earth First, when the Earth First became part of the ecological and anarchist landscape in the 90s in the UK. Obviously, they come originated in America in the 1980s. So I was very much. It was an ethnographic study. I've had a few years being active with them. That sort of bled over into an awful lot of other activities and anti-consumerism kind of campaigns, and I got people to keep diaries about their hitchhiking, which then fed into my hitchhiking research. And kind of anarchist book fairs and kind of like radical green conferences, and it would be hard to sort of say I became part of this group then and then that group there. There's a whole kind of milieu around in Manchester, which is where I did the PhD in the mid 90s. But also parallel to that, I was, like I suppose you called me, an anarchist musician. James Bowen, who I did the two anarchism books with, he goes out as James Bar Bowen now, but we had as a musician, but we had a band called Bar the Shouting, and we used to play a lot of, radical politics, festivals, protest things, animal rights, and we propped up the stage at the 1 in 12 Club in Bradford, which is an anarchist social centre, which has been going for 30 years. So we played there quite a lot. And we kind of got a little bit of a kind of an overlap with, I suppose, the anarchist music scene, or certainly through him anyway. So there was another side to kind of my activism, I suppose, as a musician. I mean, I played the drums and wrote some of the songs. Yeah, I suppose that was different from the anarchist academic of anarchist studies and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's always difficult to kind of sort of work out which hat you've got on, and people often used to. You'd ring them up about something and they say, is this about hitchhiking? No, it's about anarchism, so, that's quite an important time for me, actually, to that kind of crossover of milieus. Being exposed to kind of a lot of political songwriting, I think there's something really interesting about the importance of storytelling rather than sloganizing. And you get an awful lot of political bands who are just kind of like, well, we've got a new song this week which is about the injustice of the week, and that kind of art for me doesn't always kind of do it. It feels a little bit kind of contrived, and because I think you've got to have that kind of human storytelling element. in what are the best protest songs? It's what are the most memorable ones. There's something which is for me, there's a Jackson Browne song which we used to play a lot called "Before the Deluge." It's about losing your idealism, and it's transferable for every single era, in the same way that something like times are changing. Kind of why I watched the Bob Dylan film the other week, and it's the things which we remember. But the thing about art and politics, it's that kind of like form and content thing that came into some of the writing which I was kind of editing in the books as well, because something John Moore was really interested in was that kind of thing about anarchist form and content. And what is, and in that sort of situation, this thing is like, if your message is kind of revolutionary, then what is the form that conveys that? The disintegrators were notoriously obscure and difficult to understand. Was that a revolutionary form? I don't know. But those kind of questions, I think, are really kind of pertinent, and John was really kind of keen to talk about those things and to test those boundaries. So I think it's always been that sort of anarchist sensibility, even when it hasn't called itself anarchism, of form and content. As an academic, I co-wrote a paper last year on with an anthropologist who's also written on hitchhiking. We did this kind of duo autoethnography kind of thing, and we didn't really know what we were going to write or what the other was writing, and we kind of mashed it together. And it's like, well, it kind of worked, that was quite fun to do, to sort of experiment with some of these issues. But I don't have any great revelations as an anarchist sort of songwriter. Apart from it's don't force it. I suppose, in terms of the message, because then you might as well not. You might just be ranting into the ether. that would be my lesson. I think James Barbone would probably say something similar. Actually, you've got to tell a good story. I think that one of the really, really important things, which kind of goes back to that reference to kind of like mutual aid and kind of COVID and things, is the sense of linking anarchist ideas into stuff around community resilience and networks and support and conversations, because I think that the amount of the lack of preparation that most people have got for the kind of collapses which we're going to see across all kinds of different systems, social, economic, and ecological, that is going to be that sense of kind of like protection and support is maybe going to be more important than trying to sort of shore up bits and pieces at the kind of like the failing institutional level. I do wonder. I mean, somebody said the other day about, is it better to go on a demo which will have very little effect, or to just go and do something locally, supporting like a food bank, or just having a beer with one of your mates who's a bit lonely. It's kind of what because we're so overwhelmed by the enormity of things which need doing. Linking anarchism to with or without an A, capital A, I think is crucial, and I also think that it might well be more kind of like effective in a sense. I've been spending a lot of time kind of reading Taoism and Ursula Le Guin's translation of the Tao Te Ching, and going back to reading Ursula Le Guin as well, just thinking about kind of currents in history and that kind of like sort of the way that things naturally self-organize, and how not forcing things can actually be a kind of really important kind of lesson. I mean, obviously you've got to shore up and defend some areas, but in terms of the kind of the programs, the plans, the templates, the top down, seeing like a state, as James C. Scott put it, these don't work. And so I think that's I've never been, like I indicated earlier, I've never been kind of sold on the big revolutionary set piece analysis of history. Obviously, that works in certain contexts, in certain times, and we don't know as well. But I think what we do know is that imposing ideas is problematic. So I'm a lot more. I think I'm more flexible and fluid with some of my anarchist ideals than maybe I used to be, and maybe a bit more localist. But at the same time, so last week I went to a citizens' assembly about kind of, which is actually to do with kind of trying to recreate British politics, and on a Palestine vigil in the light of the prescribing of the organisation in the UK. Are those anarchist politics? I don't know, but those things which I can do effectively and and connect with other people, and that seems to be as important a criteria as any other, really. So one of my roles as an anarchist academic, I suppose, has been to obviously write about social movements, like Earth First and so forth. But so I took a career break. I had a bit of a breakdown at my first academic job. I ended up looking after my parents who had Parkinson's disease for quite a few years. Started to do some research on hitchhiking, which I did an awful lot of, and I'm not fully retired yet from that either. So I wrote a book called Driving with Strangers: What Hitchhiking Tells Us About Humanity, which came out about 3 years ago. And that, I call it vagabond sociology. It's very much kind of roadside analyses of societies. Each chapter's kind of a different kind of, almost like an anarchist lens on society from the roadside. And I draw on things like gift economies and, it's like David Graeber and Marcel Mauss. And so there's a whole plethora of kind of stuff which I've written around hitchhiking, which kind of been kind of quite important to me as a hitchhiker and academic, as a sociologist and an anarchist. So I'm trying to apply some of these things to get more local car sharing and so forth right where I live. So yes, that would be that was something which was nice to be part of conversations about anarchist sociology over the years, and alongside people like Dana Williams and Jeff Shantz. That's my other kind of other big project, apart from the earlier anarchism books as well.